After decades of neutrality, Finland has finally joined NATO as Russia-Ukraine war unfolds in Europe. The move by Finland, which has angered Russia's leader Vladimir Putin, could likely impact Moscow's military policy as well as the East-West rivalry. The economic impact of the Russia-Ukraine war is being felt everywhere across the globe, and the CEMAC sub-region has not been left out. For a country like Cameroon hoping to attain emergence by 2035, experts say that it is a major challenge. On this edition of the program, we shall be looking at the situation of NATO, the war in Ukraine, as well as the economic impacts in Cameroon, as well as the CEMAC sub-region. Stay with us. My guest is Director of Strategic Partnerships and Business Development at Prima Finance and Investment, a microfinance bank in Cameroon. He holds an MBA with a finance major from Cardiff Metropolitan University. He was previously an economist at the Carrefour Policy Institute. Between 2020 and 2022, he led the Cameroon-Nigeria Trade Project and works with senior stakeholders across policy, trade, and innovation to influence policy. He was the lead researcher for Africa on the demographic dividends, a project sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which unlocked an economic dividend for over 25,000 African youths and families in 5 Central African countries. He previously worked with Sterling's Global, a UK-based e-commerce tax company, and has participated in several government-led tax consultations on research and development tax credits. He also worked as an investment researcher for Bazinga, a market intelligence firm based in the United States, providing market analysis for investors and corporate clients across North America and Europe. Following this, he has also worked closely with senior management at EU cryptocurrency company OBTrader, leveraging machine learning to inform the trading decisions of bots and trading algorithms. He is a contributor at the UK-based Economic Intelligence Unit covering Sweden and Switzerland. He continues to publish extensively on monetary policy, innovation, and business intelligence. Join me to welcome economist and public policy consultant at the NATO Strategic Division South Hub, Henri KOUAM. Henri KOUAM, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is shared. Now, just as we heard in the introduction, NATO is 74 years old now, and
Yes.
one new member has added to the fold, which is Finland. In the light of the Russian-Ukraine war, what is your appraisal of the move by Finland?
It's necessary for Finland to join NATO because Finland has a 1,340 kilometer with Russia. And Finland has previously fought a winter war with Russia, which was devastating. And we know Finland is a Western country with Western liberal values, and therefore joining NATO will provide much needed security. One of the advantages of joining NATO is that Finland will benefit from Article 5, which states that an attack against one member is an attack
one for all.
against, yes, essentially, all for one and one for all. And so that would provide some security guarantees, which Finland needs, and it would prevent Russia from thinking about encroaching further territory from the West. Let's not also forget that Finland plays an important strategic role geographically because it's situated between Russia and Norway and Sweden. And so it's the first line of defense, if you like, against an attack from the East. So this move is welcome by most watchers, by most analysts, because it provides a much needed balance, which has been absent in Ukraine.
Now, for many years, Finland had stayed neutral
Yes.
before taking the decision to join NATO. Why do you think that, first of all, Finland opted for neutrality and now the decision to join NATO?
Well, most Nordic countries have always opted for political and diplomatic neutrality. This is because historically they focused on economic development and have wanted very little to do with wars and conflicts across the world. Now, the Nordics themselves fought several wars, and although they have these policies of neutrality, it's to protect them and to make them impartial in global and international politics. Unfortunately, the world has changed, and even the Nordics have to adapt to a fast-changing world. The war in Ukraine, a more aggressive China, an intransigent Iran, uncertainty in the Middle East, and great power rivalry are complicating the geopolitical terrain. So the Nordics, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland all have to adapt to a new reality. And that's what has caused them to not shun neutrality, but choose a much more credible and practical option.
All right. Now, so much is being talked about the military benefits
Yes.
of the alliance with NATO, but what could be the economic advantages of Finland joining NATO at the time when we observe that the war in Ukraine also has some economic consequences?
Yes, that's correct. Now, Finland, for one, is one of the very few European countries that haven't been badly affected by the war in Ukraine, because Finland, like Sweden, rely on renewable energy to power their infrastructure, their industry, and their households. So economically, there has been an impact, but trade with Russia is minimal for most of the Nordic countries. On average, it ranges between 2 to 5% of their total trade. Now, Finland joining NATO will provide avenues for job creation in the security domain, because of course Finland will now have to spend close to over 2% of their GDP on defense. And it means that they would have to source their materials and the military products either locally or internationally from the United States, from Canada, from Switzerland, or other components from EU countries. So ultimately, this increases spending, which increases demand, which increases employment. Now, the employment may not be concentrated in Finland, but joining NATO would mean that they have to open an office, for example, and they need to have personnel, and they need to ensure that they're prepared in the event of any attack, and that is going to generate some positive spillovers. On the strategic side, I think Finland joining NATO would allow both militaries and security across the West to become a bit more integrated. And insulating supply chains means that they're going to be much more resilient against future shocks caused by the likes of Russia. Now, let's not forget that the war in Ukraine, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, has caused European countries to rethink their energy policies, their security policies. What President Macron was calling for back in 2018 now appears very much real. And it wasn't him being Jupiterian, and Europe has to ensure that it's self-sufficient from an energy standpoint. You can't rely on Russian gas and hope to impose your values when you're unable to meet your basic electricity and energy needs.
Demands, yeah. All right, now another country expected, of course, to join NATO is Sweden.
Yes.
And over the years, the adhesion to this body has been blocked by Turkey. What exactly is the problem?
Turkey and President Erdogan have a Turkic minority called the Kurdish militants. Now, these are people who are agitating for change in Turkey, and they're viewed positively in some Western countries. Now, unfortunately, they're viewed as terrorists by President Erdogan, and he wants Sweden to admit that the Kurdish are terrorists, and he wants them to begin transferring some of the people who have been designated terrorists on lists in Turkey. But Sweden can't do that because Sweden has a very large Kurdish population. In the Swedish parliament, a significant number of parliamentarians are equally Kurdish, and so they're agitating for change, which Sweden thinks is good change.
Good change.
Advocating for workers' rights, for political plurality, for the rule of law. Unfortunately, the Kurdish people, the Kurdish minority in Sweden and the Kurdish minority in Turkey live in very different worlds. The Kurdish minority in Turkey are more prone to violence. And so President Erdogan sees all Kurds as violent terrorists. Now, and that's why he thinks it's problematic for Sweden to be joining NATO, and he's obstructing Sweden's bid to join NATO.
Now, but now in the midst of this problem, are there measures that have been taken by maybe neighboring countries to see how they can resolve it?
Yes, so several summits have taken place in the last year, over three. And Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, has been calling for Turkey to see reason and to ensure that the alliance isn't frayed or threatened by the war in Ukraine. Now, unfortunately, that rings hollow with President Erdogan. More recently, an activist went to the Turkish embassy in Stockholm and burnt a Quran. Erdogan was furious. It's an election year in Turkey, and so he needs to appear strong and violent in front of his electorate. And he thinks merely forgiving Sweden and allowing them to join the alliance appears weak and meek. And Erdogan thinks it will take quite a bit of time and further convincing in order for him to accept. But let's not forget that Turkey was recently hit by earthquakes, which devastated the country. And Turkey is going to need to rely on Western aid in order to rebuild. Now, Sweden and Finland are going to play an important role when it comes to aid in the reconstruction of Turkey. So the question is whether we're going to see diplomatic and economic realism meet, and there's a chance that that might perhaps encourage Erdogan to allow Sweden to join NATO.
The war in Ukraine has affected commodity prices as well as energy. What is the situation in NATO's member states?
So NATO member states a majority of NATO's member states import minerals from the likes of Africa, but also from Asia. Now, the value chains and the trade linkages haven't been badly hit due to the war in Ukraine. But the world still relies on wheat from Russia, corn, sunflower seeds, crude oil and other distillates. They rely on Russia and Ukraine for fertilizers as well. So generally, international agriculture and fertilizer markets, commodity markets have been badly hit and badly impacted due to the war in Ukraine. Now, the Western countries themselves last year saw an unprecedented increase in inflation directly linked to the war in Ukraine. So whilst they might not be suffering from a shortage of metals, they're suffering from a shortage of natural gas imports. And, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was equally attacked and sabotaged last year, which gave further justification to Russia to prevent Europe from accessing natural gas. So Europe has been affected directly. Inflation has gone up, consumers are poorer, central banks are equally raising interest rates, which is further complicating the lives of consumers and businesses. So last year was a difficult year, but this year will be equally difficult due to the war in Ukraine.
All right, now I want to ask this layman's question, because the question which so many people have been asking. They say every time people talk about the war in Ukraine and Africa is just there. How important is Africa to NATO?
Africa is an important partner for NATO. We signed a strategic partnership in 2019. There was the Warsaw Agreement back in 2016. NATO views Africa as a strategic player in international politics. NATO has an office at the African Union headquarters where they coordinate directly on financing, procurement, capacity development, training, and coordination and coordinated responses to terrorism, specifically in Sudan. Now, Africa has loads of security partnerships. We've seen the Chinese have been quite effective in Mali in that regard. But NATO plays a much more long-term role, and NATO wants to ensure the long-term sustainability of African armies, and also make sure that if there was ever a threat against Africa, we can jointly respond to that threat. So NATO views Africa as very important and believes in the sovereignty and independence of African states.
Okay, now we have been talking about the effects of the war, and one aspect which has been impacted is safe currencies. What are safe currencies, and how has they been impacted by this war?
So the war, safe haven currencies are currencies that are considered safe when there is a crisis. So if you think about safe haven currencies, it's like if the world is burning, it's like having a spare house somewhere. Now, these safe haven currencies are the Swiss franc, the Japanese yen, and the US dollar to a lesser extent. Now, the reason why they're safe is because they've got economic and political stability. I'll give you an example. For example, in Switzerland, if they want to change banknotes, as they did recently in Cameroon, they would hold a referendum. Everyone will vote on what banknotes they prefer, what picture they prefer, before it's implemented. So they're highly democratic and transparent. They've got a strong and stable economic system. They're usually technologically advanced, and they're not held back by things such as trade agreements or economic trade zones, etc. This is why Japan and Switzerland are considered safe haven currencies. When you have the war in Ukraine, investors take their money from riskier assets. It could be equities in China or Africa, and they go and they buy and they purchase safe haven currencies or safe haven assets, because they know that those assets are safe from any geopolitical and economic uncertainty.
Now, what factors affect the performance of these safe haven currencies?
Global risk. So when the war in Ukraine started back in March, the Swiss franc and the Japanese yen appreciated by well over 5% in the 3-month period and stayed there. Now, that appreciation was directly linked to the war in Ukraine. And as you know, these currencies tend to outperform during bad times and perform normally during good times. So if, for example, the war in Ukraine was protracted and dragged on to next year, the Swiss franc and the Japanese yen might depreciate every now and again, but generally there'll be a floor that will support the currency and provide and ensure that the currency doesn't depreciate materially. And this is why investors like them.
But now, what could be the impact of this on Africa's financial system? We know that financial currencies in Africa are generally weak compared to the euro, the dollars,
Yes,
the
absolutely.
Japanese
yen, also equally
yeah.
highly volatile.
Yeah. So, what could be the effects of these safe haven currencies, especially on how they play out within challenges and situations affecting Africa?
So Africa relies quite a bit on foreign direct investment, be it in the tech sector, be it in the manufacturing sector, be it in the agriculture sector. Now, the war in Ukraine already slowed appetite for investment, because the war in Ukraine caused inflation to go up, to rise in advanced economies, averaging between 5% to 8.8% in some advanced economies. And therefore, during this period, investors prefer to pull away from currencies and countries that they deem risky. Now, unfortunately, the franc CFA is pegged to the euro, so that prevents the excessive wild swings in our currency, which protects us a little bit. However, if you look at the Ghanaian cedis, the Kenyan shilling, those currencies at some point fell significantly over the last year. Not only because we have our own domestic problems of over-indebtedness, and but also due to the fact that during a crisis such as what we see in Ukraine, very few African countries are able to adapt financially and economically. This is why it was subject to high inflation. This is why it was subject to lower imports or a greater dependence on imports from other products from other countries like Russia and Ukraine. And so for investors, they prefer to go to countries that are considered more stable because already operating in Africa is deemed a bit challenging. Now, if you add risk to a difficult operational environment, people are much more ready to flee.
Okay, the Chinese yuan has replaced the US dollar in Russia as a result of sanctions that were taken against Russia. What impact is that having the Russian economy and the fallout on the global economy itself?
So there's been talk in the last years, from 2018, there's been talk about other currencies replacing the dollar. But I think that's a little bit alarmist. If we're being completely honest, the dollar is and still remains the most important currency in the world. Over 70% of foreign exchange transactions are cleared in the dollar. If you look at international, although the dollar makes up only less than 20% of international trade, over 50% of international trade is cleared in the dollars. Now, China and Russia are what we can call inflection points, the anomalies. And it's a significant step for the yuan to be used to clear trade, but that's equally being done because Russia doesn't have a choice. It's not a natural move. If Russia was so bent on supporting Chinese supremacy, they would have done this 3 years ago. So we're seeing the East in some ways adapting to a new economic reality. But rather than view this as an encroachment on China's part, it's a natural economic occurrence. And for the Russian economy, this would mean that they can trade more with China. It would mean that they can protect their terms of trade, and it would mean that they have access to international payments which are non-dollar based because they've been excluded from the SWIFT system. And they've been sanctioned across all major global banks. Now, and so I think this is a natural occurrence. It's nothing new. If you look at the foreign exchange reserves at the central bank, less than 10% of those, less than 5% of those can be attributed to China. We hold more dollars, followed by the euro, and then followed by China. But we still hold the Japanese yen and the British pound. So the world is diversifying. I don't think it's a narrative that should be seen as anti-American, or it shouldn't be seen as though America is a weapon of war. Decline. Yeah. America is in decline. Far from it. The world is diversifying, and rather than overemphasize the point of the yuan, African countries should be thinking of using their own currencies. There's no reason why I want to buy from Nigeria and I can't pay in Naira. Why are Cameroonian traders buying from Nigeria and using the dollar to trade? Why are Ghanaian traders buying from Cameroon and paying in US dollars? So we have to get a lot more prouder about our own currencies and what we've accomplished and how far we've come, rather than rely on the yuan or the dollar, because ultimately this is going to be used as a geopolitical tool to influence the policies in Africa. Now, the dollar is a powerful tool because, one, it can be used to sanction anyone in the world, and secondly, because it's accessible. The dollar is very liquid, and we know that in the United States, it means that they can always finance their deficits and borrow from the world and spend as they see fit. So what's happening in Russia, I think, isn't going to accelerate the adoption of the yuan because China is refusing to modernize and open up its economy. For China to become a true competitor, they can't have their currency trading at a particular amount to the dollar every single day. It needs to be decided by markets, it needs to be decided by you and I, and it needs to be decided by the economic realities. So the yuan has some way to go. I think what happened in Russia is good for Russia's trade, but I don't think it will materially impact financial and international economics in any material way.
All right, thank you. Now let's come back to the CEMAC sub-region,
Yes.
which has been affected by so many economic and financial shocks since the start of the Russian-Ukraine war and even before. Projections indicate that growth rate for 2023 will be at 3.3%. That's below 2022, which was 3.5%. The outgone president of CEMAC, who of course is the president of Cameroon, Paul Biya, revealed that during the recent summit in Yaoundé. What accounts for this drop?
Several things. Inflation last year was 3.5%. And we know that once prices rise, people consume less. Now, and when things get expensive, people only buy what is necessary. So inflation has obviously dented domestic consumption, because when people feel poorer, they have to eat only what they can eat. Maybe rather than buy eggs, I'm going to only buy bread and butter. And so all of this has impacted the CEMAC economy. Now, secondly, the CEMAC region imports quite a great deal of wheat and sunflower seeds and sunflower oil from Russia and Ukraine. Now, when an agreement was struck last year to allow the sale of grain, it was restricted to European countries and North America in some cases. And so Africa didn't get to benefit from that. Now, you have high inflation. You have the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, because the COVID-19 pandemic fundamentally changed our economy in several ways, in how workers approach work, in the functioning of the healthcare system, in how our products were viewed and accepted internationally as well. So all of these factors have contributed to slowing down the economies of the CEMAC region. And secondly, economies are little diversified. For Cameroon, over 56% of our GDP comes from services. So transportation, hotels and tourism, etc. Now, what that means is that when you have a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic or the war in Ukraine, that impacts tourism. And we know that on average, Cameroon has 1 million tourists a year who spend on average $1,000 to $2,000 during their visits. So all of this contributed to slowing down the CEMAC economy.
Now, what can the leaders do in the wake of these growing challenges to ensure that they keep the economic in very good shape?
Good question. This question is always asked, isn't it? What can the leaders do? I think what the leaders can do is set policy that is accommodative. And we've seen the government has made some progress in that light. Now, if you open a business in Cameroon, for the first 3 years, you don't have to pay taxes. But we know that the tax rates are quite punitive. They could range from 17 to 32%, depending on what type of company you are and how much you make. That is highly punitive for businesses across the sub-region. And we know that governments face pressure to raise tax revenues. And so what they can do is, first of all, making sure that the ecosystem for businesses and for entrepreneurs is a bit more accommodative. So yes, 3 years of not paying taxes is useful, but the government could equally use subsidies a bit more judiciously to help the people who need them the most. Because merely starting a business and operating for a year or two doesn't guarantee any success, to put it bluntly. So on the policy side, governments must ensure that the tax rates are reduced and made a bit more accommodating towards entrepreneurs and businesses. And secondly, they must ensure that there is a continued development in human capital. because one of the challenges that we suffer from in Cameroon is that sometimes we cannot compete with our peers internationally, which means that we have to focus on upskilling the entrepreneurs and our workers in Cameroon to produce what we will eventually consume.
Now, what role can the African Continental Free Trade Area play in all of this?
Right. Very good point. The African Continental Free Trade Area would lower trade barriers, will lower tariffs. It means that goods and services will be able to flow from one part of Nigeria to another part of Guinea to another part of Egypt. So, but the African Continental Free Trade Area will only be useful if it's implemented and implemented now, because we signed this, the agreement was signed in Kigali. But since the agreement was signed, less than 20% of African countries are effectively implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area as is. So the African Continental Free Trade Area is useful, but we have to implement it. And implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area doesn't mean writing a number of policies and leaving them on the Ministry of Trade's website. No. It means getting civil society together, businesses, entrepreneurs in the room, and showing them how it works. It also means simplifying trade procedures. If I wanted to export stools or I wanted to export chairs, it should be easy and straightforward. I shouldn't have to go through 5 offices. All of these processes should be digitized so that people understand what processes they need to go through in order for them to explore and access new markets.
The future of the franc CFA still remains a major debate, particularly within the CEMAC sub-region. During the summit in Yaoundé, very little was said about reforms. Some experts say they were disappointed because very little was said about the reforms of the franc CFA, particularly on monetary cooperation. I would like to ask, how delicate is the franc CFA situation?
I think we need to be honest here. I think we need to be honest in that, are we ready to move away from the CFA franc? There are a number of things that have to happen for us to move from the CFA franc. We need to have some convergence in a current account deficit and a fiscal deficit. You cannot be indebted and want to create your own currency. It might work, but the chances of that failing are significantly larger. We don't need to become an Argentina, no pun intended. But we need to make sure that the African economies grow sustainably. We need to make sure that our fiscal deficits, our public spending, our procurement, our economies need to work effectively for our currencies to be used properly. Now, when some work has been done regarding the currency, first of all, our reserves have been moved from the French Central Bank. We do have representation in the Monetary Policy Committee from France, but our currencies being pegged means that we have to find a way to ensure that all of the countries that would use this currency, the ECO, all of the countries that we use the ECO have to converge. We need to make sure that the current account deficits are in more than 2%, for example. This is what the Europeans have done with the Maastricht Treaty, where you cannot have a fiscal deficit of above 3%. And it forces countries to think very carefully about their spending. So before we talk about becoming independent, which is good, it's necessary, and we cannot stay reliant on Europe forever. We need to make sure that we create the conditions in place for that currency to be successful. So I'm happy. I think it's something which should have been evoked when the heads of states met. But the fact that it wasn't evoked, I think, illustrates that there's much more work to be done.
And they are probably taking their time.
Yes. Now, of course, this would come from policymakers, but it would also come from the private sector, Because if today we have our own currency and we're still using the dollar to trade between Cameroon and Chad, then what's the point of having your own currency? So we need to make sure that we also raise awareness about having what it means to have your own currency. In Europe, over 40% of their trade is cleared in their own
In your
currency,
currency.
in their own indigenous currency. And this means that they have a great deal of control over how that currency performs and over how the economies perform. And trading in our own currency simply means that trade will be significantly improved over the long run. But it's important that we just don't call for African countries or Cameroon to have our own currencies. We should be doing that whilst being mindful of the work that needs to be done to get there.
Okay, now we have realized that major currencies like the euro, the dollars are positioning themselves internationally, either directly
Yes.
or indirectly. For the CEMAC zone and Cameroon, where does that leave the franc CFA?
Well, we are pegged to the euro. I mean, whatever happens, the president of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, François Villeroy at the Banque de France, they know that we are pegged to the euro. If the euro becomes much more international, it makes our currency a little bit more stable. At the moment, I think it's 655.
Yeah.
Now, the euro, Jean-Claude Juncker, the outgoing president of the European Commission, chose to internationalize the euro because they wanted to free themselves of unilateralism from the United States. So the euro becoming much more international is going to benefit us by making our currency much more stable. Now, Japan hasn't taken any real steps to improve the adoption of its currency, which is why it's surprising that in the last decade, China is beginning to overtake Japan in terms of reserves held by central banks. So the Japanese, they have a well-functioning economic and financial system, perhaps one of the most advanced financial systems. And so the need for them to internationalize their currency isn't as pronounced as that of the Europe. For us to have a multipolar world, we need an integrated Europe and we need an international Europe. That doesn't stop Africa from being international and from being independent. We can coexist. The world has many countries, and although two or three countries or continents may be fighting for supremacy, it doesn't mean that the other countries have to let go of their economic ambitions in the short run or over the long run.
Okay, I would like us to discuss cryptocurrency because you are an expert also in that domain. The use of cryptocurrency in the CEMAC zone has become a very thorny and complicated affair. The Central African Banking Commission, as well as the Financial Markets Supervisor Consumer, have completely outlawed the use of currency. Why is the sub-region not open to cryptocurrency?
Well, why will we? Less than 75% of people in Cameroon have access to regular electricity. And you're telling me that we should adopt crypto that uses a significant chunk of energy to mine and to process transactions? Maybe we're putting the cart before the horse here. I'm no Luddite, and I think that some technology is useful. But how did we go from the CEMAC region having very little access to electricity to adopting cryptocurrencies? I mean, I am sorry, but it's for me,
Hasty.
It's hasty, it's not useful, and it shows that there's a disconnect between the economic realities and the political pragmatism that should exist. So cryptocurrencies are good, they're innovative. The technology behind cryptocurrencies is what we should be focusing on. It can be used in hospitals, it can be used in marketing, it can be used in manufacturing. And so the blockchain technology can ensure that peer-to-peer transactions run much more effectively. But I do agree with the central bank here in that I think cryptocurrency, adopting cryptocurrency as a form of payment is hasty and unnecessary. In Cameroon, the majority of people have mobile money accounts. Perhaps the penetration rate is estimated at 76% or so. But the number of bank account holders range between 14 to 21%. You can't tell me that in a country where people don't own bank accounts and where financial transactions are expensive, you're choosing to adopt cryptocurrencies. To me, I think it's an attempt at fallacy.
Now, what effects can the adoption of a cryptocurrency in this type of rough environment have on the banking sector in the sub-region?
Firstly, if many more people begin using cryptocurrency, what happens? It means that a significant amount of money is taken away from the real economy into cryptocurrency. It makes our currency much more fragile and much more volatile. You might go to buy eggs today and one egg costs 100, and tomorrow that same egg costs 200 or 250. Now, and so first, it can cause inflation to rise very high. And secondly, it can precipitate or accelerate a banking crisis. Let's imagine that you have 500,000 in your account, and then your bank takes your deposit, maybe 300,000, and goes and invests in crypto. Tomorrow, the price of cryptocurrency falls. That bank has made a loss. They have to repay you, and this is how government will then have to bail them out. So it's imperative that so the second risk is that it could lead to, it could precipitate or accelerate banking crisis. And there's a third risk that it could reduce the sovereignty of fiat currencies. We spoke about the internationalization of the euro, the dollar. We're seeing the yuan being used across the world. If we want the CFA or the ECO eventually to be used across the world, we're going to have to make sure that we adopt it and we understand how it works so that we use our own currencies and not simply adopt a cryptocurrency because we think it's innovative and other countries are doing it. In the Central African Republic, where they've adopted cryptocurrencies, which is laudable, what has happened since? They have to set up the infrastructure. They have to set up new regulators. They have to build the infrastructure that's going to power that cryptocurrency. But that's a country where less than 65% of people have access to electricity. So I think the central bank is right. There are significant economic and financial risks that arise from crypto, and we should approach with caution.
Now, talking about banks in the sub-region, we have realized that liquidity problems are becoming more and more apparent in banks within the CEMAC sub-region, and BEAC also appears not to be injecting much of that liquidity into the sub-region. What accounts, first of all, for the limited liquidity in the zone?
So if you look at the CEMAC region, you'd find that the international banks tend to have more liquidity than the domestic banks. Now, this is because the IMF has always encouraged us to borrow from our local banks. But when the government borrows from local banks, it sometimes takes a longer time to pay these local banks.
Yeah.
And so this means that these local banks sometimes don't have the money to power the economy. Over time, and I recently completed a study on the impact of private sector versus government lending. You'd find that lending to the private sector is much more effective and efficient and productive than lending to the government. And so a mix of factors have meant that banks in the CEMAC region have less liquidity. Firstly, sometimes these banks borrow from international markets, but they don't lend from international markets to invest in the economy. they lend from international markets to pay off their debts. This is so essentially what's happening with the Cameroonian state, where we'll go to Ireland last year to borrow 500 million. It's used to repay debts rather than invest in the economy. That's equally what happens with the banks. Now, the Bank of International Settlements released a report last 2 years ago, which showed how the second round effects of this activity of lending to pay back debt is actually detrimental to the economy and to the financial positions of the banks. Now, secondly, regulations are present, but they need to be much more iterative and enforced. For example, in Cameroon, we don't know when we say banks have liquidity problems, it's because we don't really know what banks are investing in. At the end of the year, if banks might produce their balance sheets and their income statements, but today, if you ask, infrastructure versus energy, how much has EcoBank invested in either infrastructure or energy? In order for us to understand the problems linked to liquidity, we need to know what's going on in banks. And so it either needs to be a requirement for them to disclose how they lend and disclose where they lend to in order for us to have a better understanding of the problem. Now, the central bank in the past has injected liquidity into the system. But because we're currently facing high inflation, the central bank has chosen not to do so in order to ensure that they can reduce demand and make sure that inflation returns sustainably towards its target.
Now, we have also seen that since the start of 2023, Cameroon is getting more and more difficult. It's getting more and more difficult for Cameroon to raise funds from bonds issued into the sub-regional financial market. What really is a problem with Cameroon not being able to raise these funds? The recent one barely last week was far below 50%.
So we were talking about bonds being undersubscribed. Now, the Minister of Finance recently decried this, stating that investors shouldn't go and buy bonds from South Africa and from other African countries. Now, the reason they're going to other African countries is because the interest rates are much more attractive. If I go to Egypt, I can buy bonds and benefit from interest rates that are currently placed around 10 to 11%. In Cameroon, these interest rates are placed at 6%. So investors naturally prefer to go to other markets as opposed to invest in Cameroon. This is why the bonds have been undersubscribed recently.
Since the start of February this year, the government decided to adjust the prices of fuel. Was it necessary?
It's a difficult choice. And sometimes parents in the house have to make difficult choices. They have to tell the kids, we won't go to the pool this month because we have to save money to, pay for school fees. This month, we're not going to go out a lot to eat in restaurants because we have to save money for school fees. Sometimes parents have to make very difficult choices. And Cameroon had to make a difficult choice because we can't subsidize fuel forever. Rather than subsidize fuel, maybe we should invest in our refinery capacity, make a one lump sum investment, build it. And that way, the price of oil can actually go down much more. The price of petrol, can go down much more than it currently is. In the United States, they pay very little for fuel because they've invested in their infrastructure. So removing subsidies is difficult because life becomes difficult for people. For people working in the transport sectors, it means that we're eating into their margins, and life in Cameroon is already hard. We get that. However, it's better that we subsidize renewable energy and remove the subsidies from fuel. So it's a difficult choice. And I know many Cameroonians say it's already difficult. Why would the government put its populations through that? Well, it's because we have to start investing in the things that will benefit that population over the long run. If we keep subsidizing the price of petrol, it just means that our kids are all going to end up sicker and would have to spend more at the hospital. So we have to think about gradually moving away from these subsidies and allowing people to adjust accordingly. And let's not forget that, without blowing the government's trumpets too hard, there's equally conversations about increases in the minimum wage.
Yeah, that has already been done.
Exactly.
Together with salaries.
Yes, and increasing them to, I think, 41,000 for people in the agricultural sector, to 60,000 in other professions, and 60,000 in non-agriculture sectors is the first step. It's not perfect, and it's not going to solve or address the problem of inflation, because if you earn 40,000 and pay 25,000 for your house, then how much are you left with? If you earn 40,000 and pay 15,000 for your house, how much are you left with? So it's not perfect, but I think it's the first step.
Okay, now, just before we go, you work with Prima Finance and Investment. What is the structure all about?
So we are a Category 2 microfinance, and we want to ensure that every single Cameroonian has access to a bank account, regardless of whether they have a smartphone and they can download an app, or whether they have a normal Churunko. We want people to be able to type in a code, add money to their account from their mobile money, and vice versa. But beyond just opening accounts and giving people access to financial services, we equally want to make sure that people are able to borrow and invest over the long run. So we offer very innovative services like the credit scoring to ensure that we can work with customers and clients to understand their needs and help them plan for their future needs. So Prima Finance and Investment were based in BMC in Yaoundé for now, but we're currently in the process of expanding and growing.
Now, for a country where most entrepreneurs or majority of the entrepreneurs do not have access to finance, how does your structure approach that challenge?
So we are focused on working with entrepreneurs who don't even have the exposure. What we do, we organize events regularly with the partners, Association Camerounaise pour la défense des droits des contribuables, ACDC for example, Association of Bayam Selams. We're working on a partnership with Campost. All of our partners, we work with them to speak to traders and to entrepreneurs directly, understand their needs, and then offer them products based on that.
All right. Thank you very much, Henri KOUAM. It was a massive pleasure having you on this edition of In-Depth on Dash Media.
Thank you for having me.
And to you, televiewers, it was a massive pleasure being with you. Until next time for a fresh edition of the program. Bye-bye.